Hey, Gummy Burger, what's up? It's a culture detective here investigating your favorite albums, and today I'm going to review the latest Godspeed You Black Emperor album. Godspeed at State's End! Exclamation mark. I'm gonna turn on the air conditioning. It's oh my god. Godspeed You Black Emperor is a post-rock instrumental rock band from Canada, and they are back once again with a latest album. And I originally planned to review this 2 days ago, but I didn't because I thought I needed more time to digest it. Now, Godspeed is one of my favorite bands ever, especially with their first 3 albums being so goddamn amazing. They started their discography with F sharp, A sharp, Infinity, which is this really dreadful and really depressed album that really plunges you into a black hole as softly and as poetically as possible. Then there is the EP, which is amazing, and then in the year 2000 we have Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven, which is easily one of the best albums of all times, and one of my favorite albums of all times as well. Between Storm, Static, and Sleep, all the tracks are pretty much amazing, given that there are only 4 tracks, but the way they cut up their tracks with different movements and sections and sort of merge it between very tragic, epic, and somewhat catchy, but yet depressing instrumental and post-rock with field recordings and other samples. It's so creative, so artistic, and so eye-opening, and so cinematic as well. And then we have Yankee UXO, which is definitely not as good as the first 2 albums, but still, with tracks like Motherfucker Equals Redeemer, it's still a pretty decent album. I mean, the guitars on that track, dun 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 dun, it's just constantly moving, and I absolutely love that. Then they had a long hiatus until in the early 2010s they released Alleluia, Don't Bend, Ascend, and it is easily one of the best comeback albums of recent decades, really. I mean, the track Mladic is this really monstrous Middle East rock freakout. It's so intense, it's so frantic, it's so noisy. I absolutely love it, and Mladic eventually become one of my favorite tracks of the entire 2010s. I think it landed at the number 11 spot. Then they started to go downhill with the album Asunder, Sweet, and Other Distress, where it just feels like they began to run out of ideas. The chord progressions seem way more uninspired, the field recordings and the drones are way more typical, and it gets even worse on the album Luciferian Towers, released in 2017, which is basically the lowest point in Godspeed's career. Then they have returned with Godspeed at State's End, just classic Godspeed, where their album covers are full of exclamation marks. Well, their album titles and song titles has a lot of exclamation marks, a lot of God and hands and P and the sun and the wind and something like that. And I didn't know. Man, I didn't know. When I first entered this album, I was honestly prepared to be disappointed. I thought I would be disappointed, and with that mindset going into the album, I was actually quite disappointed, at least in the first 20 minutes or so. However, the second half is actually way better than I thought it would be. So one standout thing about this album is that it is less drone, more post-rock, but that being said, it is not a complete departure from the last 2 Godspeed albums. I mean, there are still moments on this album that feel uninspired, drab, and bland, unfortunately. So when the album stayed at the number 1 spot in Radio Music, I was like, really? Is it really that good? Is it really that friggin' good? Come on, guys, really? So Like many other Godspeed albums, this album is basically two 20-minute long monster rock tracks, and in between these two tracks, plus an outro, we have a drony, smaller tracks. So the first 20-minute long monster is a military alphabet, and it's just bland, unfortunately. I mean, the track just sounds like Storm, but uninspired. The track opens off with these very interesting sounding sloshy static field recording, which is all pretty mysterious and interesting until it reaches Job's Lament, which is just such a drag. It just feels so sluggish. I mean, there are points where it sounds like the band is finally going to fire up something interesting with the ascending bass guitars, but aside from that, it just drags on and on and on and on, and God, speed, you Black Emperor. Then we have First of the Last Glaciers, which also has a very sluggish first half. The second half sounds more interesting and solid and eventful, and the chords are definitely a little bit more interesting, but it doesn't save the very boring first half. And the track just ends off with Rockets for Mary, which is a very silent field recording. So overall, this track just didn't really do it for me. However, we have Fire at Static Valley, which is interesting because this track actually sounds like a companion piece almost to their absolutely intense and mind melting static off of their 2000 album. And essentially, this track, while it isn't very catchy or uplifting or anything, it's absolutely apocalyptic. This track sounds so freaking apocalyptic, so dreary, so concerning, so worrisome, so anxiety inducing. It's actually amazing. And when I listen to this track, I'm like, ooh, oh, ooh, oh. It's amazing. The chilling delays, the melting strings, the very concerning pounding percussions underneath. It's like a warning sign, but musical. And then afterwards, we have Government Came, which is another 20-minute long monster. The first half is absolutely fantastic, and easily my favorite Godspeed song since Mladic. The weepy strings and beautiful guitars are present on this track, but what really steals the show for me on this track is the very sour and toxic guitars in the middle, which reminds me a lot of like the film soundtracks off of like a 1940s or 1950s film noir, because it's so vintage. It sounds so vintage, and it sounds so dramatic, like melodramatic at the same time, yet it's so sour and old. It's concerning, really. Also very tragic and apocalyptic the way the guitars sort of envelop and engulf itself and swallow itself. It's something to be heard. And the second half of the track is essentially Cliff's gaze slash ashes to sea nearer to thee, where the guitars sort of build up once again after a quiet moment, and it's turned into something very uplifting and optimistic. And I'm not too crazy about the second half of Government Came, to be honest, even though I think it's certainly great. However, it's not like Godspeed has never done something like this before. I mean, it kind of reminds me of We Drift Like Worried Fire, where it goes from something really scary to something very optimistic and heavenly. But that being said, still a really strong track and one of the best tracks of the year so far. And then the album ends off with Our Side Has to Win, parenthesis for DH, which has these drony, dreamy strings. And at first, I didn't really like this track. I thought it's a really boring and bland track for an album ending. But the more I listen to it, the more I like it. In a way, it sounds like a perfect soundtrack for a movie ending, especially a movie that is really tragic and depressing. It just sounds really epic, but heartbreaking, but at the same time very conclusive all at once, and I kind of like it. So yeah, while the ending isn't like the best album ending of all times, I still think it wraps up the album quite nicely. So overall, Godspeed's latest album, I think, still is nowhere near as good as their first three albums. However, there are musical moments in the middle of this album that kind of impressed me and made me think, dang, this is not bad, not bad. So yeah, favorite track here is Government Came. Least favorite is Job's Lament off of A Military Alphabet. I'm giving Godspeed You Black Emperors Godspeed at State's End. I know I'm going to offend a few people in this review. Forgive me. Please forgive me, okay? It's just my opinion. And I think this album's not bad. It's not a negative score, okay? A strong 6 out of 10. So, have you listened to the latest Godspeed album? For 1 to 10, how much you rate it? Like if you like it, and subscribe if you want more. And thanks for watching. I will review Igloo Ghost tomorrow. Brockhampton is releasing their album tomorrow, so I'm going to review that someday soon. Nubian Twist, Arm & Hammer, and The Alchemist, AJR. And, yeah.